Hello, I'm Peter Carter, Director of the Climate Emergency Institute, and I'm making another climate emergency video. This one is a really big, bad one, I'm afraid. There are a couple of huge things that we've become aware of very recently that put the dire climate emergency on a new, higher level. The first one is, and this is absolutely incredible, the organized, aggressive climate change denial campaign has erupted, so to speak, once again. There's an organization, they're in Europe, they have people all over the world. They have done what they did a couple of times before. They've got together 1,100 signatures, and of course what they're doing is that they're claiming there's no climate emergency. In the past, you'll remember that when they did this, they were claiming there's no such thing as global warming or climate change. And then I think the next time they did it, they claimed that, well, there might be such a thing as climate change, but it's nothing to do with human sources, so it's nothing to do with the fossil fuel industry, so it doesn't matter, it'll just come and go. And they have articles looking like science papers. They haven't been they haven't been peer reviewed, and none of their statements actually, and they got a lot of them, have any evidence published behind them. But you know, that doesn't really matter because we know how terribly effective these denial campaigns are. I mean, at this stage, and of course I'm going to explain to you why the climate emergency has just also reached a new level of high. So at this stage, to have this climate change denial campaign, obviously the fossil fuel industries and maybe other industries are behind it because they're obviously very well funded, you know, I wrote the co-authored the book in 2018, Unprecedented Crime, Climate Science Denial. And I thought at the time of writing the book that, you know, when you go into it, it's a little bit more than a crime. You know, this is really evil what's going on. And so we've definitely reached that stage of criminal evil with these people, with this organization. So to the science. Now the science has got worse and worse and worse for many, many years. I think we're all aware of that. I watch the climate indicators, you know, there's about 20 of them, and I document them on my website on a monthly basis. Right from the get-go, you know, back in the 90s, they've continued to increase, and now, of course, they're way, way, way above the level that we started off with the United Nations Climate Change Convention in 1992. It's just stunning, the levels of emissions and the levels of the indicators, the levels of the atmospheric greenhouse gases. So obviously the all-important thing, rather than actually the precise global average temperature increase, the most important thing, of course, is the concentration of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because they cause everything. The breakdown of the climate system, which is now occurring, and it's been occurring for some years. And we're not any longer in a climate change situation. We're in a climate disastrous and catastrophic situation. So this is 2022, and of course we've had the unprecedented climate extreme event disruption summer of 2022, which is truly unprecedented and truly historic. Nothing ever has happened anything like this summer of 2022. We've had heat waves right across the northern hemisphere. Of course, this is a northern hemisphere summer. And early heat waves. They've occurred way earlier than they've occurred before. And they've lasted way longer. So we have this disastrous situation driven by greenhouse gas emissions and atmospheric greenhouse gases, in which we are getting a much longer period of heat waves, let alone the most severe heat waves. And we've had the same thing with drought, right? We've had drought occurring earlier than ever, and continuing to last longer than ever. We have had severe drought right across the northern hemisphere too. Now, the United States, America, very recently had another heat wave during last month, September. It's still hot, but things have settled down into some kind of normality now. It's in October. China, you remember, had an unprecedented drought, rivers drying up, and Europe had an unprecedented drought with rivers drying up. The scientists, we never anticipated that we could get into a global heating situation in which our rivers actually dried up. So that makes us in a new, most terribly dire situation. And inevitably, we're going to get this again, and inevitably, this situation affecting the northern hemisphere, where all the best food-producing regions are, for example, and it's going to happen time and time again, and it's going to increase. Now, the IPCC sixth assessment, of course, they said, and I want to note this because of this denial campaign, the fact that we have climate change is unequivocal, and it's also due to human activities. So this is actually the second time they've made that kind of statement. But this is the most recent time, and it had a lot of strong backups because in the sixth assessment, we had since the last assessment, which was in 2014, we have had so many over these years, so severe weather events that, of course, this time the IPCC said, and I think really for the first time, that all of these severe weather events have global climate change, global warming behind them. They're all caused in the sense that they're made much worse by being driven by global warming greenhouse gases building up in the atmosphere. So, of course, they also made the statement, and the statement was a warning, that these weather events will get worse. They will. We have so much atmospheric greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, an unprecedented amount, that we're locked in for a long time to global warming and climate change and to these extreme weather events. In fact, in the sixth assessment, the IPCC stated something very significant, and that was that they said that from the time that we wake up to our senses or get rid of the evil of the climate denial, but from the time that we decide that we're going to have policy and we're going to put global emissions into decline, it will take 20 years for that to show up in a leveling off of the global temperature. So this is now coming from the IPCC. So yes, we do have 20 years locked in. Therefore, we will be at 1.5 degrees C. This remains a goal of incredible disbelief with me, because I find everybody, and I mean everybody, is claiming that 1.5 degrees C can still be kept alive, which is absolutely absurd. It's completely false. It's a totally false scientist coming from the scientists, with just a couple of exceptions. The AR6 made it very clear that 1.5 degrees C would be, as they said, in the early 2030s. If you look at the projections on the temperature, they actually 1.5 comes around 2030, and this is a really terrible thing, Because what we need to be doing, of course, is to be preparing, which is a massive effort. We need to be preparing for the globally disastrous 1.5 degrees C that we'll be in less than 10 years. And we're not preparing because we're talking about it. We're talking about adaptation and resilience and all this kind of stuff, but nothing is being done because it's a vast enterprise to prepare the world for 1.5 degrees C. And the reason nothing is being done is a absurd falsehood is being put about that we still have more time. We ran out of time long ago, long ago. The indicators show that everything is getting worse, faster. Now, unfortunately, I've been saying this for at least 5 years. I've been presenting the indicators at conferences, and my conclusion has been, when you take them all together, that we are trending towards biosphere collapse. We're trending towards the literal end of the world. And of course that's being denied, but our problem is that these people, organizations, are denying there is a climate emergency. They are saying that everything is fine, everything is good, CO2 is great, and they brought all the other denial aspects by attacking the science. Firstly, of course, the big indicator is our emissions. So you remember that we had this very sharp drop in emissions with the lockdown, global lockdown from the COVID pandemic. But the governments poured so much recovery, economic recovery money into the fossil fuel industry that they drove the emissions back up just as fast. So in March of 2022, the International Energy Agency told us the emissions have rebounded. They've not only rebounded, they're at the level of 2019 that was at a record high. And they said later this year we definitely will be at a record high. They also told us that this year-on-year increase, the economic recovery funded by the governments, is the largest year-on-year increase ever. So greenhouse gas emissions have never increased as fast as they were made to increase as a response to COVID. The IEA also said in this March report that most of the emissions came from coal. Of course, the worst of all greenhouse gases, and the worst of all fossil fuels. And coal took up 44% of the increased emissions from burning energy. You know, I keep on saying in my YouTubes, in my tweets and Facebooks, I keep on saying that our governments and our corporations have us on a death sentence. And there's no question, when you look at the incontrovertible indicators, the measurements, right, that the climate sciences, the climate science denial campaigns have never been able, of course, to question those. Because, as the IPCC, those are more unequivocal than anything else. So all three, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, they're all increasing as fast as ever, but they're actually increasing faster than ever. The WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, last year put out their regular greenhouse gas bulletin. And there they had them all lined up, and you could see that over the past few years, they'd all increased, the rate had all increased. Most notably, though, methane. Methane has literally taken off in an explosive increase. Fast. Now, some years ago, you know, we didn't hear very much about methane. the climate scientists put all their attention on carbon dioxide, and they figured, you know, we'd get carbon dioxide down and then we'll deal with methane, because methane really, they said, well, isn't as important as carbon dioxide, although it does produce 25% of the global heating, and methane doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide on an average lasts 200, 250 years. About 25%, and we've known this for decades, of the CO2 emissions that we put into the atmosphere, that amount of CO2 is still in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now. So that's why many of the scientists say that, you know, carbon dioxide is a forever greenhouse gas, and we've got to slash it. Now, methane has come into the news because, number one, the scientists became aware that the big drive to increase the production and use of natural gas is mainly methane, the big drive inevitably was leading to increased methane emissions. And the reason is that this natural gas, of course, this is fracking, like oil is now fracking, particularly, of course, in North America, that you get methane released, but you get fugitive emissions, so-called emissions that escape. And this is really pretty inevitable because, I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of miles of natural gas distribution pipes do we have, you know? I mean, the amount is just phenomenal. So we know the scientists have established that now our burning of fossil fuels for energy is releasing more methane into the atmosphere than ever before. We've always known that coal releases methane. Coal mining, the extraction of coal, leads to release of methane. We knew that in the very early days of coal mining. But now we have added onto that. We have this huge other source of methane from the natural gas industry. There was a flattening of methane, atmospheric methane concentration from 2000. There's all kinds of reasons for that, one being the collapse of the Soviet Union. But from 2006, methane started increasing again. Now that was really, really bad because already methane had increased more than double its atmospheric concentration pre-industrial, 1750, 1800. So by 2000, the atmospheric methane had doubled, way higher increase in carbon dioxide. Although carbon dioxide has never stopped increasing. The atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration has never stopped increasing. Right from the start of monitoring CO2 in 1958 in the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has continued to increase. But methane is increasing as fastest than ever, and that's compared with the other two greenhouse gases. Since about 2015, methane just took off. And now, even in the past couple of years, the concentration has increased yet again. The scientists, have been publishing that this is a very, very worrisome situation of very great concern, as they put it. Well, of course, it's more than that, because we're in a situation where we are looking at an unlivable planet because of the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Now, this word was used a couple of times by the IPCC in their sixth assessment. They said, we have to secure a livable future. Those were the words they used. Everybody should have listened. That was a warning, right? So methane has now reached the absolutely unbelievable level of 1,925 parts per billion. And its pre-industrial level was 720 parts per billion. So methane is now increased by a factor of 2.6. It's not going to be very far away, as the scientists already said, that atmospheric methane will have increased 3 times above its pre-industrial level. Now, methane is way more powerful, a greenhouse gas, than CO2. It's 86 times more powerful over a 20-year period after it's been emitted. So that's huge. And the very worst part of this methane emergency, as Ewan Nesbitt has put it in a recent article that I'll get to, the very worst thing about the emergency is the scientists have concluded by using carbon isotopes that this very recent boost in atmospheric methane is coming from feedback, is coming from the planet responding to global warming by the planet producing more greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's feedback, and that's methane feedback. That has been for decades our very worst nightmare. So the scientists have determined that the tropics that are rich in peat in the Amazon region, for example, and lower down, across Central Africa region, and of course in Indonesia, and which we all know because of deforestation and also burning peat. Because of global warming, that they are emitting more. And as the scientists have pointed out, this is uncontrollable. So we really, really are in the worst nightmare. Perhaps the world leader on methane is Ewan Nesbitt. He's in England, and he's published some great stuff on methane, no question. So he was so concerned that he actually had published in a newspaper, in the Scotsman, an article, a lengthy article explaining what the scientists think is happening. The last line is there a methane emergency? Yes. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that all of the increase of methane is coming from the warming wetlands feedback. Far from it. All human sources of methane are increasing, and the feedback is just boosting that increase further. And so I borrowed this from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to do excellent work. You'll see here it's agriculture, and it's fossil fuel operations, and it's waste operations. So cattle and ruminants exhale methane. There are 1 billion cattle in the world, and that's increasing. Also with agriculture, there's rice paddies, which are artificial wetlands, and the rice paddy fields are increased, and with the warming, that increases the methane emitted from them. And then there's fossil fuel operations, of course. Coal, oil, and gas emit methane. Oil operations the least. Coal mines emit methane, we've known that forever. And now there's an increasing large source of methane from the natural gas industry. Treatment of waste emits methane, particularly landfills. And in some developing countries, the landfills are absolutely huge, and they emit a huge amount of methane, which has been shown up by the satellites. You can add to that the Arctic has switched from a carbon sink to a carbon source. That's because of methane emissions combined with very unexpectedly high carbon dioxide emissions. This is, of course, from thawing permafrost, and thawing permafrost for decades has been our nightmare, worst fear. The thawing permafrost is also actually emitting the third big greenhouse gas, which is nitrous oxide. We also know, however, that the Amazon and those tropical rainforests, the Amazon has switched, or is at very best switching, from a carbon sink to a carbon source. When I look at the CO2 satellite images, that they have satellites now that are so clever, they can measure the concentration at the surface of the planet. The Amazon is literally pouring out CO2, vast amounts. So we have that as well. While we have a campaign with telling people we have no climate emergency. The reasons for the climate emergency. There's obviously no question that we're getting increasingly severe, prolonged, and extreme weather events. Surely everybody knows that. There's no question that the Arctic is undergoing a massive transformation. There's no question that the Amazon is being cleared and burnt, and that continues. It's been going on for decades, and that is also as bad as ever. So there's no question that's happening, and there's no question that the forests have started to change. And so the IPCC actually in 2014 in their fifth assessment said that we have increased mortality of trees in our forests, and we have an increase in dieback within those forests on every vegetated continent. So the evidence of the climate emergency is absolutely rock solid. Now, fortunately, in 2018, 2019, a scientist in North America, environmental forestry scientists, decided that they should really do something about the situation, because we were all realizing we were losing our planet, we were losing our future. So what they did was very brilliant. They put out once again a document and a statement with lots of signatories, which was put out in 1992, called The World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. So they said, everything is unbelievably worse than when this was put out, when this warning was put out, that we were headed for a catastrophe to our planet and to our human population. So they republished, they updated all the emergency evidence as well as other evidences, and so they put out, it was peer-reviewed and published, the second World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. And then the next thing that they did, which I was very pleased about, was that they put together a paper with the experts, peer-reviewed, of a world scientist's warning of the climate emergency. You know, when I was shocked to find that we had this denial campaign launched again with another, 1,000 signatures, I was really, oh my God, thank God Bill Ripple and Bill Momo and the others scientists had the foresight and the good sense to do that. They got a huge number of signatures on their paper on the climate emergency. Not only that, they redid it in 2021. They realized that just from 2018, which was the science up for just a few years, that everything had got way worse, way worse. So they updated all of the damaging impacts, because they are damaging, they're not potentially damaging anymore, they're literally damaging our planet in a multitude of ways. So they put out this repeat, and they have collected and are collecting signatures on that. So we do at least have that to take on this terrible, criminally evil climate science denial campaign. Dangerous climate science denial campaign, I suppose I could put it. So What about the other effects of atmospheric greenhouse gas pollution? Because it's pollution, right? It is pollution in the air by the fossil fuel industry and pollution in the atmosphere by the fossil fuel industry. Their pollution in the air, by the way, leads to the death of over 10 million people every year, every single year. Now, according to our Western definition of what represents evil, which of course goes back to the atrocities in the Second World War, there's no question that leading to the death, completely unnecessarily leading to the death of 10 million a year is criminally evil. And when you add to the fact that they're still emitting because they started a climate denial campaign, you add that in, that is unbelievably evil. It is incredibly, incredibly evil. And it's still going on. They started the whole thing up again. We used to assume that sometime in the future, the fossil fuel industry, when things got really bad, if they were left to go bad, for example, if we discovered that the oceans were acidifying, we assumed that they'd say, okay, hey, gang, we've got to do something about it. But they haven't. Manifestly, the worst of this evil is that as the complications, as the impacts have gotten worse and worse and worse, as the climate indicators have got worse and worse and worse, the denial campaign under the fossil fuel industry has got more and more aggressive. The oceans. The ocean, of course, what's called the world ocean, is by far the largest and most important component of the climate system. It's not just the climate that we are changing, it's the climate system which we are changing, which basically constitutes all the systems of the biosphere. So with respect to the ocean, greenhouse gas emissions, all that heat, I think everybody has heard that most of that heat goes straight to the oceans, straight to ocean heat. 93% of that heat, right? So what we're seeing with our global surface warming, which by the way is accelerating on the worst case scenario, what we're seeing is just a sort of leftover amount of heat after the heat goes to the ocean. Ocean heat is unquestionably accelerating, and it's very, very, very bad. Ocean heating it leads to ocean deoxygenation, and fish and creatures that live in the ocean need the oxygen in the ocean to live, to survive. And ocean deoxygenation is increasing at a rapid rate. It also, of course, and everybody knows this, CO2, that one main greenhouse gas, directly causes ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is accelerating. So we have these three things, three damaging impacts on the oceans: ocean heating, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation, all increasing extremely fast, all making each other
Our UN
worse.
Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a recent public statement, probably about 10 days ago now. It was a special statement, and it was clearly a statement with regards to the COP27 coming up in Egypt. And he said, we are in a life and death struggle for survival, while climate change gallops on ahead. So he said it before. I mean, he said several years ago that climate change was simply an existential threat, a threat to the existence, a threat of extinction, to most life on the planet, particularly the life of humankind. I think it was 2015 he said that. And here we still are, emitting more and more. So we have the worst kind of evidence now, unquestionable, published over and over, that we are in a climate emergency which is rapidly, rapidly deteriorating. And perhaps I'll finish off by mentioning a couple of recent climate science papers that got quite a deal of publicity because they were papers of a kind that really we hadn't seen before. In particular, the first one that came out is in, I think it was a month, maybe a bit over a month ago now, was a paper which addressed catastrophic climate change. Now, the scientists have never used such a term, ever. They've never even used disastrous. So really, from my point of view, this is a breakthrough moment. You know, we had a team of scientists, of experts, peer-reviewed, and they explained the reasons, many reasons, why we were now in a risk of climate catastrophe. We were now in a risk of not only human civilization collapsing, which is bad enough because that would be the end of the world. I mean, that would just be a miserable, insufferable existence, but most of life on Earth. So that paper's being published. Then another one, which I guess came out a couple of weeks ago, was a paper on tipping points. And this paper, again, was a shock, because we've had the science of tipping points. We've known about that for many, many, many years. But these scientists, who, you know, are the scientists, Tim Lenton, for instance, at the University of East Anglia, they realized that we must be getting closer to the tipping points than we had suggested by publications in the past. The thing which runs right through the climate science, which relies on computer models, what has been happening really ever since the mid-2000s, what's been happening is that we have been getting impacts decades ahead of the scientists' computer models. And for instance, decades ahead, for instance, the scientists working on the Alaska permafrost, they say the permafrost is thawing at a rate which wasn't anticipated to occur until 2090. So many, many, many decades faster. It looks like a runaway situation. So the tipping point paper, they re-evaluated 9 tipping points. The tipping points are all planetary catastrophes. They also pointed out that these tipping points could occur together and could interact and each make the other worse. And in their re-evaluation, they said, even today, at just over 1 degree C, we may have crossed a number of tipping points. They projected, they evaluated that between 1 degree C and 1.5 degrees C, there were 5 tipping points that were at risk, very likely to be crossed in that period of time. So this confirmed in specifics what this previous paper had said about climate catastrophe, that we were in a catastrophic climate change disruption situation. And my sense is that this evil recurrence, relaunch of the climate denial campaign is because the science has become so definite. The science has shown increasingly that we are closer and closer and closer to a planetary catastrophe. That's why I think they've launched this campaign. This campaign, yet again, designed to confuse people, to deceive people, and to put a public question mark on whether we should be doing anything about climate change at all. Now, I want to repeat that the chair of the IPCC, Hossein Lee, in the Madrid COP25, in the plenary, in the big opening, formal opening, he made the statement that if we didn't get global emissions into decline within a year, 1.5 degrees C would be out of reach. Now, I mean, we're way beyond that, right? By the way, every single year matters now. Every single year matters, because the IPCC assessment said every tiny increment of global warming now matters, because it could push us over the edge. So the situation for what I call our common future survival, a bit of play on the Brundtland Commission that came out in 1988. Our common future survival now completely depends on getting global emissions into decline immediately. So at the recent COP26 in Glasgow, Hossein Lee, of course, made a statement on the science again. And in this statement, he said, if global emissions don't decline immediately, he used the word immediately. The word immediately, by the way, appears time and time again in the IPCC 6 assessment on mitigation. He said if emissions aren't put into decline immediately, rapidly, 1.5 C will be beyond reach and 2 C will be beyond reach. 2 C is absolute catastrophe, and 2 C is catastrophe because 2 C is the absolute limit that we can reach and not trigger the worst planetary tipping points. We have science on that, published in 2018. That became known as the Hothouse Earth paper. Top climate expert team, peer-reviewed, of course, and I took the trouble of really reviewing that paper carefully, and I went through the supplement and everything. And yeah, it's 2 degrees C for every single one of these catastrophic tipping points. My friends, everything is against us. Everything is currently against our survival. It really, really, really is. And perhaps the worst aspect is that we're facing a organized, coordinated climate change denial campaign again. I'll finish with one other absolutely terrible thing that is against us as well, and that is this horrid war which is going on in Europe. This horrid war which is being waged in the country of Ukraine, which is now well recognized as being a proxy war between NATO, actually between the United States and the Russian Federation. And so we are watching in real time what was a very beautiful country and cities. We're watching those cities be absolutely demolished on a day-by-day basis. We're watching young men on both sides being killed in the most horrid way. And of course we're watching the war crimes that always occur with war. So if we don't make peace, we can't wait. We don't have any time. We can't wait for one side to win this war, which is an absolutely ridiculous, crazy thought. We have to make peace. And there's been so few efforts to do that. Now, if we don't make peace, this is not just a world war, as it has been called. This is a war that will end our world. Because there's no agreement going to come under the UN with such hostilities going on between nations. It's not possible. I remember back in 1992, the Rio Declaration. The Rio Declaration actually ended with a statement that peace is a prerequisite for sustainable development. And
We should have grown out of wars long, long, long ago. I believe this is a war over fossil fuels. I think that's pretty obvious, and it's being fought with fossil fuels. And because of the war, not only are the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable, and the most socioeconomic vulnerable, millions and millions and millions of people on the brink of starvation. Not only that, but we have countries switching back to coal. So we're going into reverse with regards to our emissions, but now we're going into reverse on the fossil fuels that we're burning. And we're going back to the very worst one, of course, which is coal. Everything is against us. And everything is getting worse faster. I hate to bring these messages, but I've kind of made a pledge to myself years ago that I would, because of my knowledge about science and interest in climate change, that I would put out what I called the terrible truth. I guess at the beginning it was maybe kind of a dark joke, but it's certainly not a dark joke anymore, because the truth is really, really, really terrible. So thank you for listening, and I would plead for everybody to rethink this war in Ukraine and to work tirelessly for peace. We can each individually work for peace. We can each do that. Just as each of us can contribute somewhat to mitigation. Mitigation depends on governments, of course. But you can go vegan. You can cut back your methane emissions. You also cut back your CO2 emissions because, of course, one big reason for going vegan is that the Amazon forest is being laid waste for cattle pasture and cattle feed. So let's all do that. I mean, let's all do the very best we possibly can. You know, no matter how bleak the future looks, and believe me, it looks bleak, we can each individually do our very, very best, and it's actually not that hard. So we need to change the narrative of this horrid war being waged with these horrid modern weapons. And we need to realize that the negotiations under the UN are not going to work without each of us getting involved and a mass mobilization against the fossil fuel industry worldwide. The idea of mobilization goes back to 2010. This is not new. Lester Brown, now unfortunately retired, very, very highly respected economy scientist and ecology in the United States. His final version of his plan for saving the planet was called B4, Plan B4, Mobilizing to Save Civilization is what it was called. It was a great book, not a big book, great book. So, and then we have, of course, the highly successful group in the United States, the climate mobilization they are called, right? So we have to mobilize as individuals, and we have to mobilize against, we have to fight the fossil fuel industry, right? We have to fight our governments who are still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And by the way, the subsidies are as high as ever, right? You know, then at least we'll have the respect of future generations, no matter what kind of plight they find themselves in. Over and out. Thank you.